Okay, recording is on. Okay, thanks everybody for coming. Today we're going to cover Dynamics CRM form design. Is it an art or is it a science? And I'm going to just kind of give you a broad overview of everything having to do with form design that I know of, and some little gotchas and things like that that I've found over the years. And then I kind of want to open up for discussions for people to comment on things they've done and seen, etc. So that's how we're going to work out today. So by now you should know who I am, Mitch Milam. I'm a Dynamics CRM architect and independent consultant and trainer. You can reach me at mitch@xrmcoaches.com. My main blog at the moment is infinite-x.net. I'm going to move that into XRM Coaches here in the next couple of months. And of course, you can reach me on Twitter at Mitch Milam. So a little bit of webinar housekeeping here. On your control panel, there's a couple things you can do, and again, we'll be interactive here at the end. So I want you to be able to understand how the thing works. You can raise your hand. That's the little thing in the B item there. Feel free to ask a question anytime that we come up to it. If I don't get to you right away, then I will get to you. And so just kind of hold on there, or I can save it till the very end. I'll go through all the questions, so we'll do that. So that's a little bit of housekeeping. Future events. I will have my standard 2 webinars in March, but right now I'm actually trying to schedule around spring break. So for those of you with kids that are still in school or college where you take a break either around the Easter holiday or for their actual spring break, would you mind in the question thing just tell me what the date range of that is, what the week at start day is that? Because I'm trying to figure out when I'm going to do it. It seems that most of the ones that I have seen start in the middle or the end of March, but I'm not really sure. So if you wouldn't mind, if you could actually put that in there in the question box, just tell me what date it is, and then I'll kind of get me a handle on when I can do that. And like I said, various parts of the U.S. anyway, it's all over the place pretty much. So some are in March, some are in April, depending on where you are and how they arrange their schedule. So I really appreciate that. So again, training roadmap. Again, you can go to xrmcoaches.com/webinars and see the recorded webinars along with anything else we have showing. Knowledge Bits is my email delivery information system that I set up. There are several channels, anything from development to administration to training. So sign up for those, and it'll deliver an email to you every day until it runs out. I've got some learning plans coming soon. I keep saying that, and I'm getting close to finishing up a few of them. And then again, more goodies are coming. So we got some practice tests, some on-demand video training, some more instructor-led training, and then I'm working on the following books there. So really close to being finished with the administration and the plugin development. So as soon as I get ready with all those, I'll email everybody and tell them they're on Amazon. So hey, keep an eye out for that. So today, what we're going to talk about are some general design thoughts. Talk about working with tabs, sections, and fields, different form types, some mobile considerations, and then finally some upgrades and considerations that you might have to worry about if you're upgrading from, say, 2011 or 2013 up to 2015 or 16. So some general design thoughts. And again, this is just my experience. And again, everybody's going to have a different experience. So when we get to the discussion part at the end, that's where I want to hear from you. So again, I'm not going to tell you everything that you're ever going to run into because I strictly haven't run into it. So just keep that in mind. But here's a few things that I've learned along the way. So I think it's very important that you really and truly pay attention to how your users use the system. So, what do they enter? Where is it on the form? How often do they update certain things? Where are the required fields, or what are the requirement levels for the different fields and stuff like that? So these things I think are very important for you to kind of answer the questions about how you lay your form out, where you put the fields and things like that. Should you have multiple forms? Or can you get by with just hiding and showing tabs and sections? These two questions kind of get people in trouble. And the reason they get people in trouble is because we have the ability to create multiple forms. So what people do, like, oh, I'll just create another form. And then they realize about 6 months later that they got a ginormous maintenance headache. And the reason is because anytime that you start creating multiple forms, you double your maintenance cost every single time you do that, especially if the forms are very similar in design. Now, there are very specific reasons, I think, to have forms, and it's usually around security, hard security. Like we cannot have any possibility of people seeing certain types of information. So that would be a case where you would want a multiple form situation. But many times you can just get by with just hiding and showing tabs and sections. A lot of times it's really not a security issue. It's just a fact of convenience or of business process flows. Okay, not the business process flow of CRM, but just the flow of the business process itself. So as an example, I had a customer a couple years ago, and they had two different lines of business. So somebody had made the decision, oh, we'll just create another form. So they copied the main form and they went and they changed it. And then what happened was they had a system set up to where when they went to create a new record, it would open up a third form, believe it or not, and ask them a single question, which is, what kind of operation is this? Business line A or business line B? And then they would choose one, and then it would display the proper form at that point. Well, this turned into just a nightmare because we had lots and lots of JavaScript on these forms. Anytime that you modified it, the testers had to test both forms just to make sure that we didn't break anything from one to the other. Some of the code was different enough to where we had to have its own thing, own set of JavaScript just for that type of function. And finally, we started looking at it, and we got down to the very end. It's like, you know what? We've only got one section of difference between these two forms. And what we ended up doing is putting them back into a single form and just showing and hiding the section, depending on the business line. Besides that one section, or two sections technically, everything else was exactly the same. And like I said, it created an absolute nightmare for everybody involved, not just the developers, but also the testers. The users didn't have that much of a problem because, again, they don't ever see what happens behind the scenes. But when you go to make multiple forms, it's very important that you really think out why you need a multiple form, because, again, the moment you hit that copy button, you've actually doubled your maintenance at least. So, again, be very careful when you get into that. So we're going to kind of talk from the top of the form down. So let's start with tabs. So with 2016, we now have our tab selector back. So you click on that, and it'll actually pop a list up of all your tabs, and you can jump right to that navigation from here. So that works as it did before a long time ago, 2011. Do you expand or collapse your tabs? Okay, so that's a big thing. So the way that the form engines actually worked when they render the stuff to the user within the browser, they don't actually render the stuff that's inside of a collapsed tab. So that makes your form load faster. So there's two things about that. The first is it makes the form load faster, but the second thing is, does the user really need to see the data that's in a tab? So the idea is you put your data that's used all the time at the top in the first tab, and you have that open. Anything else that they use occasionally, you put below that, of course, but a lot of times it's a good idea to actually collapse the tab so that they don't see it. Because people are kind of weird, everybody's weird in some little way. I can't excuse myself from that at all. And one of the things that kind of freaks people out is when they see a lot of data entry fields, they feel that they have to fill all those data entry fields in, and it basically makes them kind of not want to use the system. So by hiding this stuff from them, you can actually encourage or hopefully ease the pain of people actually using the system. I know it sounds kind of odd, but that's just what I found. Back in the days of 2011 and before, it's what I call the white box syndrome. So, we had a blue background with a white data entry box, and people would get freaked out when they saw 200 fields they had to fill out. So 200 white boxes, we had to put data in. Like, well, you didn't have to put data in them. They just wanted the data. They didn't need the data, in many cases. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you have any kind of iframe, say, it's very common, especially with CRM Online, to have a map. And what that map is it'll go out to Bing Maps and bring up a map of the record, stuff like that. If that's not needed on a frequent basis, as in almost every time that you want to use it, then what you need to do is collapse the tab that's on, because again, it will not actually populate that iframe until you expand the tab. So something else to keep in mind. Okay, so if you've never figured this out, the tabs can have several different formats. So we have 1, 2, or 3 columns. So the one column is quite obvious, it occupies the whole space of the form. But the 2-column and 3-column options have different variations of column width inside of those. Now, again, this is not the tab. I'm sorry, this is not the section. These are actually columns within the tab the sections reside inside. Okay, so you can default to 1-column or 2-column where everything is equal, or they have some predefined where they have like a 3366 or something like that between the two, and variations of that. And if that doesn't float your boat, you have the ability to actually modify by hand the 3 different versions at the bottom using the column 1, 2, and 3 widths. So you can actually set one specific. So if you have an extremely specific use case, you can actually modify the form tab to fit your liking. And remember, sections go in the tab, so we're going to talk about that in a minute. But remember, this is just the layout of the tab. The sections go in the tab, and the fields go in the sections. So everything has to kind of work together. So this is just your starting point. Okay, so let's talk about sections. So like we just covered, we have different things we can do within the tab, and then the layout of the section is exactly the same, except for the fact that you can't do things ad hoc. So we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 columns. So this is the actual layout of the section itself. So if you have a 2-column tab and then you have a 4-column section inside of that, what you end up with is 8 columns. Because what you can do is you can put one section inside of one tab with 4 columns, and a section in the other column of the tab, and end up with 4 more fields, and that gives you 8. Okay, so we'll talk about it in a minute, but be very careful with that. So yeah, be very mindful of your overall page width. Okay, just because you have a 40 wide inch monitor does not mean all of your users do. So you know, the whole testing paradigm for developers, they're like, works on my machine. Well, it looks fine on my machine, but yeah, then you go and you give it to a user and they can't see anything because they're scrolling all the time. So be very mindful of what you're doing with your layouts, especially when you get into the narrower widths, because what will happen is the form rendering engine will actually start wrapping things, and many times what happens is it will wrap a label out of existence. So you'll have a bunch of boxes that you can't see what the contents are, or what the label is that tells you what the contents are. So be very, very careful of that. The section label. So the default is not to show a section label, and again, it's really kind of depending on what you're trying to accomplish with the section. So a section is a container of fields. And so you can show the label on the form, you can show a line underneath that. So that basically breaks up visually the different groups of fields within the user interface. So you look at this example, the top section has a section header with a line. The other 2 sections, and these are all sections, believe it or not, do not have one. So again, does this help or hurt the interface? It's kind of really up to you. A lot of times we use the section title to actually just break up the interface into logical groupings of fields, because everything kind of runs together with the monochromatic interface we have with CRM. Another thing that we can do, and again it's controlled by the section itself, is we can modify where we put the field labels. So we can put them on the left, which is a default, on the right, or centered. We can also, so this is basically that. I got that out of order. So we have a field position also, where we can put the fields, the labels on the side, which is the default, or on top. And then this is what you end up with. Okay, so these are 2 sections you can see by the big break there. The fields on the top have a left-oriented side label. The ones on the bottom have a left-oriented on top label. So sometimes the on top actually makes your interface look better. The thing you have to worry about is to be very, very consistent about how you're using these things, because just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do things. Okay, so what happens is if you start putting your labels on top of the fields, then what happens is you will actually generate 2 different interfaces, and that confuses users, because visually they can't, they have a hard time adapting to where the field actually starts. So if you start using the on top thing, unless it's a very specific thing on one record or one entity type, then you might need to do that everywhere. That's kind of what I advise. Oops. Okay. So this alignment here, it's kind of hard to see, is left aligned at the bottom. Sorry, left aligned at the top and right aligned at the bottom. Okay, so another thing that you can do. This is the most overlooked setting in all of CRM. I did the presentation maybe a couple, 3, 4 years ago, and I mentioned this thing called a field label width. And I actually had people email me later on, and people who had worked with CRM for years, and go, I never even knew that thing was there. And it's there, but you don't ever change it because a lot of times you just kind of skip past it. But this is the actual width of the label. It defaults to 115 pixels. So it's always been like this. It's always been in exactly the same place on the section. It's right in the middle of the section properties. And what this allows you to do is reduce the amount of space that you have between the label and the actual data entry field. And the reason we would do this is if we have a label that's very small and we have a lot of space. So say we're doing multiple columns and we want to put as much room for the fields as possible, what you do is you reduce the width of the label. So here's 3 samples. So we have I put the aging fields on the account. The default is 115. I dropped it down to 80 and then to 60. And as you can see, the field is getting closer and closer to the label. So the key here is you can change this to make it make sense for a specific section if you want, but also remember different things like if you have multi language options here. Some languages are wider than other languages. Some languages are right to left instead of left to right. So you've got different things you have to deal with that. So just when you start modifying this, just be careful what you're doing. And again, screen resolution and width and all the other stuff will come into play here as well. So when you start to move this again, make sure you test it on a normal user's monitor to make sure that everything is coming across okay. So one of the things that kind of irritates people about the way that CRM does data entry, for those that use a keyboard, is that they use a in order tab order. So the tab order is what happens when you hit the tab key. So when you're in a field and you get done entering the data, if you hit the tab key, it will jump to the next field in line. The way the default for CRM is actually an in order, so it will go down. Down, and when it gets to the bottom of the section, it will go up to the next column in that section, if there is one, and then go from there down. A lot of people like to use a Z order, so they're going from left to right, top to bottom. And in this kind of example, if you can see this was a way that we circumvented this back in the CRM 2011 days, etc. And I'll talk a little bit about that because there's some caveats to this now. And what we would do is we would create multiple sections right in a row. And what that gave us the ability is we actually create 2 fields per section. And when they all combined, it looked like it looked normal. It doesn't now. That's the thing I'll cover later. It looked normal, but we're actually tabbing from left to right, top to bottom, instead of up and down. Okay, so that's something to kind of get used to. So another thing that we kind of have to worry about with some of our forms is, since monitors have generally gotten wider, do we keep our vertical orientation for our form on the web client, or do we go spread out horizontally? Like, for instance, this is actually one of my forms of the contact from my my main CRM instance online, and I had these 3 different sections, one after the other vertically. And then one day I figured, like, I've got a wide monitor and it's really just me looking at this stuff. So what I can do, I can just move those sections to be horizontal and at the same level. And so I just modified the tab to be a 3-column tab and then moved each section into that. So that gave me one very quick view of the data so that I didn't have to scroll up or down depending on how things worked out. Okay, so again, is this something that will help your users? Because that's what we're doing this for. Again, if they have a wide monitor, it might. If they don't, then you can stick with the normal way to do it, which is the vertical up and down stuff. So the next question you have to kind of ask yourself is, what do I do with these tabs and sections and stuff? I've got lots of choices. So as you can see here, on sections we have 4 different kinds. On tabs we have 6 different kinds. What do we do here? And really and truly, the only way you're going to figure this out is to just go and do it. So sometimes it's easier to put in a single column section inside of a multi-column tab, depending on your data, how it's laid out, and what the actual contents is. Okay, so again, it really depends on the field type and what you're doing. So really and truly, there are no right or wrong ways to do this. It's just whatever makes sense for your users to work in. So some final thoughts here. You can create some very interesting and productive layouts using the various formatting for the tabs, the sections, and then the fields. But, as I mentioned, don't overpower your user with design elements. So don't be fancy just to be fancy. Make sure that the work that you're doing actually supports their work, either the data entry or the data view. Okay. The most important thing is be consistent. Nothing freaks a user out than to have different parts of the system act differently or show up differently. You think about it. Right now, as it stands with 2016, CRM 2016, there are 4 different navigation types within the product. Some dating back to CRM 4.0 with a toolbar, then we get to a ribbon, and then we get to the navigation that's 2013 and above, and a couple more in between. So there's actually 4 different ones in there that will actually confuse users to start with, so you don't need to add to that. So let's talk about fields. So like everything else, we have a column width. So it's really kind of up to you, depending on how you want to specify should a field consume more than one column. In many cases, it makes sense to do 2 columns. So you're in a 2-column section. You want it to stretch out to occupy all the space of the row, so you make it 2 columns. 3 and 4 columns, again, is totally going to depend on your section. You can't make something out of nothing. So if you don't have three columns within your section, you're not going to be able to span 3 columns. So one of the kind of interesting things about this is the way that the columns work and the way that the form is rendered itself is when you start hiding fields. If you have a 2-column section and you hide a field, you end up with this ginormous gap. Okay? This took me a while to figure out. I had a customer, it's a local customer, I was working on one of their forms one time. I'm like, why is there 4 inches of empty space at the top? And what I'd realized, it was on opportunity product. They weren't using all the opportunity product fields, so what they did is they just hid all of them. Instead of moving them to a section and hiding the section, they just hid all the fields in place. So their form didn't start till halfway down the screen. Okay, I'll fix that later on, but this is the thing. Now, interestingly enough about this, if you have a single column, it does indeed remove the space. And I'm fairly sure the reason for this is it hid the space that was occupied by the field, but since you were in 2 columns, the stuff to the right of that was not hidden. The way that the form engine used to work prior to 2013 is if you had an empty row, as in if you hid one field and the other column within column or columns of the section were also empty, it would collapse the entire section in that space to not show a blank. That's not how it works now. Okay. So the question is, if you have this situation, should you just make your fields read-only instead of hidden? That really kind of depends on your design and a whole host of other things. There's kind of a school of design where, which CRM follows to a pretty large degree, is you don't show people things they don't have access to because it causes questions. So having a blank space there may be worth the effort of doing something else with it. So maybe instead of hiding the fields, you put them in a section and you hide the section, which responds a little bit better to the collapsing of the form than a set of fields does. So again, it really kind of depends on what you're doing and where the fields are, etc. So one of the things I like to do, and again, this is hard in a lot of situations, but I really do not like it when I go to save a form and it's bouncing me all over the form to fill out required fields because they're all over the place. So when I say if possible, it doesn't make sense a lot of times to actually put all the fields in one place just because they're required. It's just because you remove them from the context in which they were created, or there are other fields that give them something that works. And the big problem with that is just doesn't make sense. But if it does make sense, if you can move everything, move it to the top, or at least in one area where they're all required, and that way people can see all the required fields. Because if you haven't noticed, the way that the warning for the required field works is it will display at the bottom, and it may not jump you back to that field if you have more than one, and it gets kind of confusing. Okay, I click save, but nothing happened. Why? And then you look at the bottom right hand of the screen, it's like, oh, I've got a required field that hadn't been filled out. A couple custom things here on specific to the data type. One of the things that you need to make a decision on with the 2-option field is, how do I display this? Do I display it as 2 radio buttons, as a checkbox, or as a list? As CRM has evolved, the 3 different things are not that dissimilar. So like, for instance, right now, a checkbox is a checkbox. Everybody knows how to use that. The list is actually very similar to checkbox but instead of dropping down, it just changes from yes to no, or whatever, true to false, whatever you have in there. So those 2 are very similar. So it really kind of depends on what you're doing and how you want to do it. But whatever you do with this, what I would advise again is be consistent. So if you're using checkboxes, anywhere, you need to be using checkboxes everywhere, strictly because it's just a consistency thing for the users. An interesting thing about lookups, you can actually change the default behavior. So the second and third option there, you can turn off automatic name resolution. So what that means, when I type a name in and hit the tab key or enter key, what it will do is it'll actually go up and try to look the field up. You can turn that off. So where they have to actually select a real thing. Likewise, you can actually disable the most recently used items for the field. So if you didn't know, the way that the most recently used items of a field works for a lookup is it will show you the last 10 selected fields for that field, or selected values for that field. Not for the user, for everybody. So sometimes that's disconcerting and you have to turn it off. Back on the topic of the Z or Y in order, Lance brought up the Z order is not an option at this point, Lance. It's still exactly the same as it's always been. You can use code, the JavaScript, to actually move the cursor around. However, that in my experience is too much of a maintenance nightmare. Plus, it's technically unsupported to move things like that. So it's a couple different whammies there, depending on how things work. But yeah, you could use JavaScript to actually change the tab order for stuff. I kind of wouldn't recommend it. I would find other ways because, again, you're going to create a maintenance nightmare for yourself if you haven't already. Okay, so let's talk about the new turbo form thing. So Microsoft made a mistake and internally started calling it a turbo form, and then everybody started using it externally, and that freaked them all out. And so it's not turbo form. It's called like the new forms or something like that, or modern forms, or I can't remember what they actually ended up with. But everybody kind of refers to it as turbo form. So long story short, what they did is they actually created a new form engine, and that new form engine renders very fast. Okay, sometimes several times faster depending on what you're doing on the form. The problem with this is, I'm sorry, let me get the house turned on. By default, it's probably turned off. And you turn it on by going to your system settings, and at the bottom of the general tab is an option for use legacy form rendering. It defaults to no, which means your turbo form is turned on. Now the problem with this is, if you're doing an upgrade from one to the other, from say 2015 or 13 or 11, doesn't matter, sometimes the new turbo form engine renders in a very strange way, and it's a lot of times it's not that it renders in a strange way. It's just the fact that the way that it places things on the form, the order that things are placed on the form, is different than what it was. So what can happen is you can have things like JavaScript issues. Some features don't work, like some of my friends started discussing this week the fact that we had in prior versions, you could actually put a web resource inside a header or footer, and then that doesn't work with the TurboForm engine. It's technically not supported, or not. It's basically by design not to do that, but it worked and people used it. Well, now with the TurboForms, it doesn't work. So now we're like, okay, well, can we get by without that? Do we need to turn the TurboForms off for everybody? Okay. So let me answer a question from Gordon. With two radio buttons, can you tell if the yes/no selections have been made or not? With a checkbox, it's unchecked. Basically, Gordon, and I think they fixed it. In most cases, it's going to be true or false. Or so basically, if it's checked, it's true. If it's not checked, it's false. If it's no, it's false. If it's yes, it's true. So depending. So basically, it's going to be one or the other. A long time ago, the different renderings produced different options or different results. So you had to actually check it to see. So for instance, a radio button would give you one set of values, but the checkbox and the a list would give you a different set of values if it was checked or not. So as far as I know, it's all the same now, but I haven't actually verified that in a while. So, but it should be all the same. So if we do a get value on that field, it should be either basically true or false. And Pradiba, what does a list do in two options? Like I said, it should give you a true or a false, or a 1 or a 0 is what I think it gives you. One or two. I may have to test that out again. Okay, so let's get into the quick create forms. Let me see a show of hands using your hand thing. How many people actually use the quick create forms within CRM? Okay. So quite a lot of you. Oh, very good. Okay. So, what is kind of interesting / irritating with the quick create forms is the fact that they actually have a dual purpose. So, if you can see the circles here, this is at the top next to the search CRM data box is a plus sign that launches a quick create form. Unfortunately, if you try to add a item to a subgrid that's on a form, it also uses the quick create form. And I have a lot of customers who have fairly in-depth forms that they want to work with. So what happens is if they want to add that like via the this embedded subgrid there, what happens is we have to have the ability to show the whole form. So which means I have to turn off the quick form for the whole thing, for the whole entity. There's no option to not show it or not use it there, but allow you to do the quick create at the top. So that's the kind of drawback to that. And again, some things is fine, but a lot of things it's not. And again, remember, this is another type of form, so the same rules we talked about before do. So it's just one of those things where multiple forms, you have multiple JavaScript, you've got multiple maintenance points, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so quick view forms. Let me have a show of hands of who actually has used or know what a quick view form is. Anybody? A few of you? Okay. So I think the quick view form is kind of underutilized because it's just it's not hidden. It's in plain sight, but people just don't use it. So what this is, if I can give you an example here, is this. So this is a box that's on the account, and right underneath the primary contact is this little box here. It has the email and the business phone number. This is actually a quick create form. A quick view form. And what this allows you to do with this configuration here is select the form that you want. So again, this is just a standard form. It's got some restriction. It only allows data elements in it, so no navigation, no iframes, things like that. But what it allows you to do is to show data from a related record, okay, on your form without having to actually go and fetch that data to display it. Prior to this, what we would do if we wanted to show the email or the phone number for a contact, and I did that a lot, is we either created fields for those on the account to pull them back somehow, either with a plugin or JavaScript or whatever, or we wrote some JavaScript that went and grabbed it and then created an iframe and stuck it underneath the primary contact to show that information. Okay, so by having these quick view forms available to us, we can actually create the form, embed it on another form, and that shows us information related to whatever entity we select, which is in this case is the primary contact. So let's talk about related data. So at this point in time, we have two different ways to display this, and it depends on exactly how your system is kind of came into existence. So the normal way of seeing things is just by clicking the down arrow beside the record on the navigation and having it display a list of related entities. So that's the way it has always worked ever since CRM has been around. The way that we started doing with 2013 is we embed that information on a grid. So the question is, do I want to leave it as on the navigation, or do I put it on the form in an embedded grid? And I think the real thing here to think about is how often is that thing used? If it's like this is a recent opportunities on an account, that's probably fairly visible, fairly referenced by the user. So that I could see that. But maybe cases is not. Maybe you've got other things. So things that aren't used all the time, you don't need to put as embedded grids. The other thing to consider is somebody at Microsoft, no idea who, made some changes to the way that the navigation was handled within 2013 and above. And so for a lot of people upgrading, what they may find is they have to modify their forms to actually add back related entities, okay? Because as you can see from this, under sales, all you have is opportunities. Well, what happened to quotes, orders, and invoices? Well, nothing happened to them. They're still there. They're just not on the navigation. So the place you actually find this is you actually open up the form in the form editor, go to the navigation, and then drag those things back onto the form navigation, and then you'll have them. So it's, do you put it there so you can see the entire list, or you put it on the form? It really and truly depends on what you're trying to accomplish and how often people use stuff. Okay, let's talk about the social pane. So I call it the elephant on the form instead of the elephant in the room. And most of the time when people see CRM 2013 and above for the first time, say they're upgrading from 4 to 2011, they're like, what the hell is that thing there? And can I move that out of the way, or can I delete it? Because it occupies pretty much half the form. And the question is, should it occupy half the form? So generally what we can do is we can leave it in place. We can move it to another tab so it's lower in the form, or we can just take it off totally. So I've done all three depending on the situation and the entity and the customer. And so it really kind of depends on what you're doing. A lot of people like to have that information right up front. A lot of people, it's like, it's getting in the way of me entering data. It's totally irrelevant. So again, this is generally what you do. There are a few things that you can change about this. The first is you can select the default tab. So it's either going to default to posts, activities, or notes. So you can select that tab at the bottom. The next thing you can do is you can change the layout. It will do absolutely no good, but you can change it. It'll always change it back to one column. I have not been able to get it to do it any other way. But one thing you can change is the row layout. So it defaults to 23 rows, which is probably the height of a screen, I think. And what happens is that's the default. If you want it to be smaller, you can just change it. If you want it to be larger to occupy all the space, then you change it to you check the box where it occupies the all available space. So pick one of those. Ben asks, can you change the fields displayed in the Activities tab on the social? No, you can't, to my knowledge. If anybody else has an idea how to do it, then let me know. Most of the time, I just showed you what you can customize in 2 screens. That's it. Everything else is the hard way. Okay. Yeah, so that really it does suck. So anyway, okay, let's talk about mobile. Let's see let me clear everything. Let me see a show of hands. Who is using the mobile client for the phone or tablet for CRM? A few. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about this for a bit. So if you hadn't heard, everybody's going to mobile. So CRM is putting a lot of time and effort into this, as you'll see here in the next few minutes. So one of the things that we do in a mobile world, at least that the CRM team has done in the mobile world, is we're actually showing our form in a horizontal layout instead of a vertical layout. Okay, so desktop is vertical, and the way the forms are written, they will actually swap over to horizontal automatically when there's in a mobile layout. Also, many of the mobile the layout settings that you've selected within the form designer are not honored because they have a very specific way that they render things. So things like where the label is displayed in the section either beside or over, if it's left or center or right justified, things like that. The column width of the label, those are totally ignored. And basically is just the rendering on mobile is just done the way that they do it. Interesting thing is you can actually control the availability of a tab, a section, or a field by selecting or unselecting the box. It's at the very bottom of any of the properties for these things. So this is a way for you to not show certain things on a mobile device. And while we're talking about that, you know, if you get into this, one thing that you really have got to remember is a mobile device is a mobile device. It is not a website. It is not a desktop app. It is a mobile device. It works differently. If you think about how you use your phone, don't try to shoehorn how you use your desktop into the same way that how you use your mobile device. It is not the same. You have to take a design approach of this is how it works on mobile, and it's a totally different approach. Okay, so keep that in mind. Maybe we'll cover that in a different webinar sometime. So the cool thing with 2016 is we now have the ability to see a form preview on not only the desktop client, which we've had for years, but also on the mobile client, either the phone or the tablet. So it takes a bit to render up because it actually kind of builds this thing up in memory. But this is what the account looks like on a tablet device. This is the simulator here. Okay. You'll notice all of the fields are locked, so it seems like in the form preview, it's just a preview. You're not doing any data entry or anything like that. You're just seeing how it's laid out. So this is what it looks like. This is the actual very beginning of the record. So it has the relationships on the left, and then the summary is the first tab, and then it's notes, etc. And as you see, it's all horizontal. This is as much as you're going to see here. The phone is very similar. It's even more restrictive, but again, it slides left to right as you work. So if you're using your thumb, you can just flick left and right depending on where you are within the format or the layout there. Now here is a cool thing. We have the ability with a mobile device to actually utilize new controls. Okay. Now, this is absolutely one of the best things that they've done in a long time, quite honestly. And I just hope sometime that they will move this back to the desktop app. I think that would give CRM just a wonderful way to do things because people are used to the modern stuff and having to go from the mobile device that does really cool stuff back to the boring old desktop is something. So on the controls tab of the field properties, you have the ability on most fields, not everything, but most, to select a specific kind of field of control that you want. So the default is just to see a Dynamics CRM label plus an option set, which this is an option set thing. It's basically the primary contact method code. And it defaults to being that. But what I did is I clicked on that add control link, and it brought up a list of controls that I can add to this specific type of thing. And then I can select if it's available on the phone or on the tablet. Okay. And then what you can do, I haven't tried this, that checkbox that says hide on the web, what I think it does is actually hides the field, but I'm not positive what that does at this point in time. I haven't actually tried it. But anyway, the thing on the right-hand side is what it actually looks like. So this is what they call a segmented control on an iPhone. Okay. So here is some examples of the different types of controls we have. And again, the type of the control that you use is going to be 100% dependent on the data type you're working with. So we have a linear slider, an option set, a switch, a star rating, a radial knob, a multimedia thing, a pin control, a website preview, a number input, an autocomplete, an input mask, a linear gauge, an actual revenue, and an arc knob. Okay, so these are all touch enabled, as you can imagine. And like I said, I just can't wait for those to get back to the desktop client, or sorry, to the web client, because I think that would just make our ability to present a really cool interface to the user that's productive and modern to be one of the best things ever. That's just me. Oh, sorry, there's a calorie control too. So you have the large one is the tablet version, and the small one is the phone version. Okay. Okay. So let's go to some upgrade considerations. So a long time ago, as I mentioned, what we would do is we would create a series of horizontal tabs, is what I called it. Okay, or horizontal sections technically. And we did this to get that Z order thing. So what happens is if I'm in address 1 city and I hit the tab key, it's going to go over to address 1 county. When I hit the tab key, it's going to go to latitude. The tab key goes to longitude, to state, province, to zip, postal code, in that order. So that's the Z order. So what would happen with 2011 and CRM 4.0 is that spacing in between the sections would disappear. And so all of these fields would look like they were in a section all by themselves, when indeed they were actually in separate sections. You couldn't tell. But due to the way that the new rendering works, that we have that spacing between them. So if you had that design and you're trying to get it to move over to 2013 and above, you're going to have some display issues. The functionality is exactly the same. It just doesn't look as nice. That's all. So just keep that in mind. Merging forms. Let me see a show of hand as who has ever merged a form. A few of you? Okay. Was it everything you thought it would be, or was it a nightmare in the making? Anybody want to comment on that? A full nightmare, blended semi-nightmare. Yeah, so there are some issues with form merging, and I don't know if they're by design or if it's a feature, but what happens is the idea is we're going to take our old information form, and for the handful of entities that have the new type of form, what they call the entity forms, we're going to merge that together. And all it does is it takes the entity form, the information form, and sticks it on the bottom of the entity form and moves all the JavaScript and all that other stuff with it. Then what you have to do is you have to go through and remove the stuff that you don't need, because everything's probably going to be duplicated to a certain extent, and then things are not going to work exactly the same, so you have to go work on it. Okay. Now, the problem with that is you can get into situations, and with I can't remember which one. With 2013, it was a kind of a problem, because you would have things that were like fields that were locked that you could not remove from the form after you did this merger. I think that they may have fixed that in 2015. I don't remember exactly, but I did one the other day. I had one customer who had one form that wasn't merged, and I merged it, and I was actually able to remove fields that were locked. And a locked field, by the way, is one that when you're a formatter has a little lock beside it. So what that means is either the system requires that, or some process that's internal to CRM requires that, or somebody has hit the lock button, or somebody has specified that that field cannot be removed because of a event dependency. So one of those three things. So two of those you can correct, and then one of those you can't. If it's internal, yeah, you're kind of screwed. So what you end up doing is sticking those things into a tab, hide the tab, and then you're really good, or hide a section, whatever it might be, tab or section, and then you just have to leave them there unused. The second thing that caused most of the nightmares is when it did this merge process, and again, I think this may be dependent on the version of CRM that you tried this in. What it would do is everything within CRM has an ID, as you probably know by now, including everything on the form. The form has an ID. Tabs have an ID, sections ID, fields have IDs, everything has an ID. Well, what it was doing is it would not actually change the ID between the different forms for things like sections and fields. Mostly sections is, I think, what caused most of the heartache. And so what happened is you went to, if you export, you were fine if you didn't export your solution. If you ever exported your solution, you could spend days fixing it. And what you had to do, believe it or not, is when you went to import that solution into your destination environment, say you went from dev to production, what would happen is you would have an error pop up and it says this ID is already taken or whatever it says. And so your course is you go unzip the solution, open the customization XML file, find that thing, give it a new GUID, zip it all up, and try it again. I spent about 4 hours one night doing that because I didn't listen to a friend of mine who said don't merge the forms. But I had a situation where I was doing a migration from 4.0 to 2013, and we had a tremendous number of fields with JavaScript connecting them together, and I couldn't recreate it from scratch. Okay. So, like I said, you just kind of got to watch for these things. Okay, I got a couple of questions or comments people made. Let me go cover those real quick. Let's see. Where did it go? I believe I had something to say. Linda says, two options, descriptions can be edited, but important that you can't default to no value. That way you can, like you can with option sets, the value always exists for a two option field. So yeah, that's a good point. So I'll take the second one first. If you have a two option field, there is always a value in the database, by the way. So if you're doing any kind of reporting on that, it's always going to be at least no. So the default is no, and it will always write that out to the database as a false. So if you're ever doing any kind of things like that, it'll always come up like that. That's what else. I'm not really sure what you mean. Where are the navigation grids used? I was talking about the navigation on the form. So basically, that's what I was talking about. Okay. Who has anything they want to contribute? Just raise your hand. I'll unmute you. Anybody? Nobody? Brian asks, is JavaScript the only option to hide show tabs and sections with subgrids? You can, that's a good. I didn't think about that. That's a good thing. Let me swap over to CRM real quick. Where is my editor? Okay. So let's. I need to add this to my deck there one day, but. Here is the thing about hiding and showing things with JavaScript. Whatever your default is should always be done with configuration. So in other words, if I have a tab that needs to be collapsed, I need to collapse that tab right there, okay, inside the editor so that when it is displayed, it's actually going to be collapsed to start with. If I have a section that is hidden, I need to hide that by default using configuration. So uncheck the visible by default. And the reason we do this is when the form is rendered, anything that is not visible by default is technically not added to the form. Okay, so that does a couple things. One, it's faster. And then two, there is a very large probability, depending on the speed of your form load, people can actually see things disappear in front of their eyes, and that freaks them out. They don't like that. Okay, so anytime you have a default thing, and what happens with if you're upgrading from CRM 2011 or 4.0 and you've used JavaScript to hide and show things, convert all of that code into configuration. If your onload event, you go through and hide a bunch of stuff, then hide it within configuration, because you're turning it on later. So again, whatever the default is for that section, field, or tab, hide it with configuration by just unchecking the visible by default. That will make everything run faster, and it really and truly won't change anything as far as the way your functionality goes. It will just eliminate a few lines of code. It makes the form faster. It changes the interface, and it makes it better for everybody. Okay, hang on a second. Let me get my stuff here. Okay, Vaughn, I get your hand up. I'm gonna unmute you. Okay, you're live, Vaughn.
Hey, but I know a lot of people do designs in a different instance, different environment. I was able to find another consultant that created a wireframe template with stencils.
Yeah.
And so I'd make my designs through there first, get it signed off, make sure all the attributes are correct, what type of option sets they're going to be, or they're going to be lookup fields, and then build inside my development site or production.
That's not bad. Yeah. Let's see, who was it? Was it the company out of what is it? Magnetism down in New Zealand? They came up with some a long time ago.
Yeah, this was probably about 2 or 3 years ago since I got it. There was a gentleman named Christian something. His website's not even up anymore, but he actually created a zip folder with using Visio wireframes and then providing stencils. So it looks exactly like a 2013, 2015 environment. So
Gotcha.
You're kind of building off that.
Okay. Very good. Thanks.
Yep.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Let's see. Brian says business rules only seem to work on fields or for fields. Most of the time it's field related. I don't use business rules that much because of the way they work. They've got a design flaw, what I think is a design flaw. So if you haven't worked with business rules, they allow you to do stuff. So like if I'm click on business rules here, I don't have any. So if I go to create a new one and I want to say I had her do something. So I'm not going to put a condition. So I'm going to say I would like to set visibility of a field, pretty much. Okay, it's all about the website. I can show it or hide it. Oops, sorry, wrong button. Set visibility. Sorry. Website. Hide that. Check it. I'm going to set my scope to be on the account, which is you can either set on the entity level, which is the account in this case, or on a specific form, or on all forms. Okay? If you set it on the form or all forms, what will happen is the business rule will actually get executed whenever the form is loaded. Behind the scenes, this logic that you see in front of you is physically converted to JavaScript that is run. It's run, is it after yours? I think it's after your JavaScript is run. I think it runs after the form load. Okay, here's a problem with this. The secondary option, which is to run at the entity level, what this will do is this will actually run at the server and unfortunately also on the form. So what happens is if you have this set just like this, it will happen behind the scenes. Now this is a bad example because we're doing a set visibility. But if I had done a calculation, for instance, to populate a field, it would happen behind the scenes anytime of the entity changed, or anytime the form opened. And I ran into a really bad situation with this where I had to turn it off because I had this rule that updated this one option set from one value to the other depending on the value of this calculated field. And what would happen is every now and then somebody would open up the form and look at something and then go to close it, and they would get a message saying, hey, the form has been changed. Do you want to save it? And they're like, but I didn't do anything. And it took me forever to figure this out because it was a calculated field that ran once a day and may or may not ever update the record. So what happened is I had to stop using that business rule because it was open. It was launching every single time the form opened, whether or not I wanted it to. I wanted it to happen at the entity level on the server, and then that's it. But that's not how it works. And there's no way to check a condition. All of your conditions are field related. There is no environment here to check. So I can't say if the form is create or update, or if it's a read-only form, then don't run this. There's none of that. So that's kind of a problem, I think, with this design. Okay. Lance, embedded grids and subgrids are exactly the same thing. So Rob, like I just explained, I use JavaScript for stuff. The thing I was just talking about, I'm going to have to convert that to a plugin because it basically, I could do it any other way, but probably a plugin is safer. That way it doesn't cause a problem with anything. Gordon asks, are there any issues with JavaScript on mobile devices? Depends on the version of CRM you have, but mostly no. We can actually now use web resources on the forms of mobile, so we have that ability. So there are just some things you can't do. The SDK hasn't documented the things that will not work, so just be sure to explore that pretty thoroughly. Tom has already left, but Tom asked if I don't put the field on the form, how to ask it with JavaScript. You do not. In order to access any field on a form, you have to have it on the form. Otherwise, you will get an error because it basically is not there. John asks, is there anything roadmap for Z order, tab order? Nope, not to my knowledge. That's just probably so far down the line, it's not even funny, so I wouldn't even think about it. Now, this last was JavaScript created in 2011 work okay in 2015? Absolutely yes, it will. As long as you're using the xrm.page model. So pretty much, to my knowledge, just about everything came across. The only time you run into problems if you're doing any kind of web service calls to the CRM web service. If you ever use the CRM 4.0 web service, which is the 2007 endpoint, that will cause a problem. So you have to use the new 2011 endpoint, which handles CRM 2011 and above. So as long as you did that, you should be fine. Let's see. Does anybody else got any questions? Okay. Well, hey, that is it for today. I will send up an email to everybody probably tomorrow that has a link to the webinar. So if you're on my YouTube channel, it'll be up there later today. It takes a couple hours to process and get it uploaded and stuff like that. So the recording will be up there later. And then if anything else pops up, then feel free to email me. And I look forward to talking to you guys later. Thanks a lot.